There are moments in life when you realize that everything you thought you knew about someone was completely wrong. This is one of those stories, and it started on what seemed like just another Tuesday morning at Rosie's Diner in Millbrook, Ohio. Mary Ellen Thompson had been wiping down the same coffee-stained counter for the third time that morning, her weathered hands moving in the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done this exact motion thousands of times before. At 52, she had perfected the art of being invisible, a skill that came in handy when you spent your days serving coffee to people who looked right through you like you were part of the furniture. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in the same simple ponytail she'd worn for 6 years, and her uniform, well, let's just say it had seen better days. But Mary Ellen carried herself with a quiet dignity that most people were too busy to notice. The morning rush at Rosie's was typical small-town chaos. Farmers grabbing coffee before heading to their fields, office workers from the courthouse picking up breakfast sandwiches, and the usual collection of retirees who treated the corner booth like their personal social club. Mary Ellen moved between the tables like a ghost, refilling cups and clearing plates while conversations flowed around her as if she wasn't even there. "More coffee, Mr. Henderson?" she'd ask, and he'd grunt his approval without looking up from his newspaper. This was her world, and she'd made peace with it, or so everyone thought. But this Tuesday was different. This was the morning that Richard Hamilton decided to make an example of her. Rick Hamilton wasn't just another customer. He was the kind of man who made sure everyone knew exactly who he was the moment he walked into a room. Third-generation money, mayor's office connections, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about paying rent. His family had owned half the businesses on Main Street since the 1950s, and Rick had big plans for the other half, plans that involved bulldozers, casino licenses, and profit margins that didn't leave room for places like Rosie's Diner. "Well, well," Rick announced as he pushed through the front door, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that made conversations stop mid-sentence. "If it isn't Millbrook's finest hospitality ambassador." His eyes found Mary Ellen immediately, and there was something cold in his smile, something that made the regular customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mary Ellen looked up from the counter, and for just a moment, something flickered behind her tired eyes. Not fear, something else, something deeper. "Good morning, Mr. Hamilton," she said quietly, her voice steady as stone. "Your usual table?" "Actually, Mary Ellen, I think we need to have ourselves a little conversation." Rick settled his considerable frame into the center booth, the one that gave him a perfect view of the entire diner. He was putting on a show, and everyone knew it. "See, I've been thinking about our little community here, and I've come to a realization." The coffee pot trembled slightly in Mary Ellen's hand, but her voice remained calm. "Would you like some coffee while we talk?" Rick's laugh was sharp and mean. "You know what I'd like, Mary Ellen? I'd like to understand how someone like you, someone whose greatest achievement in life is pouring coffee without spilling it, thinks she has any business giving advice about property law and development rights." His voice was getting louder, making sure every person in that diner could hear every word. "Because I've been hearing some interesting stories about you sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." The silence that followed was deafening. Even old Mr. Peterson stopped stirring his coffee. Mary Ellen stood there, still holding that coffee pot, and something was happening behind her eyes. Not the broken look of someone being publicly humiliated, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like calculation. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Hamilton," she said, but her tone had changed, just slightly, just enough that anyone really listening might have wondered why a diner waitress sounded so completely unruffled by a public dressing down from the most powerful man in town. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean." Rick was enjoying himself now, playing to his audience of uncomfortable neighbors. "See, folks, our Mary Ellen here has been playing amateur lawyer, telling people they don't have to sell their properties to legitimate developers, filling their heads with nonsense about property rights and legal loopholes." He leaned back in the booth, spreading his arms wide. "Now I ask you, what does a woman who spent her whole life waiting tables know about real estate law?" That's when Mary Ellen did something unexpected. She smiled. Not the forced customer service smile she'd worn for 6 years, but something else. Something that looked almost amused. And for just a moment, so brief that most people missed it, her eyes swept across the room with the kind of sharp intelligence that didn't belong on a small-town waitress. "You'd be surprised what people know, Mr. Hamilton," she said softly, setting the coffee pot down with deliberate care. "Sometimes the most interesting conversations happen in places like this." But Rick was too caught up in his performance to notice the change in her tone. "Interesting conversations," he barked out a laugh. "Mary Ellen, honey, the only conversation happening here is me explaining reality to someone who clearly doesn't understand her place in the world." What Rick Hamilton didn't know, what nobody in that diner knew, was that Mary Ellen Thompson had been having much more interesting conversations than he could possibly imagine. Late-night phone calls with lawyers from Columbus, careful research sessions at the county courthouse during her days off, quiet meetings with neighbors who were starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to accept whatever low-ball offer came their way. And there was something else Rick didn't know, something that would have made him reconsider everything about this moment if he'd had even the slightest clue. But Mary Ellen just stood there, taking his abuse with the kind of composure that should have been a warning sign to anyone paying attention. Instead, Rick kept talking, his voice growing more condescending with every word. "You know what your problem is, Mary Ellen? You've spent so much time in this little bubble that you actually think you matter. You think your opinions count for something." He gestured around the diner like he owned it, which, according to his plans, he would soon enough. "But here's the truth, sweetheart. You're a waitress. That's all you've ever been, and that's all you'll ever be. So maybe it's time you stopped pretending otherwise." The words hung in the air like smoke, and every person in that diner felt the cruelty of them. Mary Ellen Thompson stood there, still holding that coffee pot, still wearing that strange, almost amused smile. And if anyone had been watching closely, really closely, they might have noticed that her hands weren't shaking anymore. They might have seen something shift in her posture, something that looked less like defeat and more like someone getting ready to show their cards. But Rick Hamilton wasn't watching closely. He was too busy enjoying his moment of power to notice that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. You know what's funny about small towns? Everyone thinks they know everything about everybody, but the truth is, most people only see what they want to see. And what Rick Hamilton wanted to see was a broken-down waitress who knew her place. What he didn't see was Mary Ellen Thompson spending her lunch breaks at the Millbrook County Library hunched over property records that dated back to the 1940s, or the way her eyes lit up when she found exactly what she was looking for in those dusty filing cabinets. The weeks following Rick's public humiliation session at the diner were like watching a chess game where only one player knew they were playing. Mary Ellen went about her daily routine, coffee at 5 a.m., opening the diner by 6, serving the same customers the same orders they'd been getting for years. But there was something different about her now, something purposeful. When old Mrs. Patterson came in crying about the foreclosure notice she'd received, Mary Ellen didn't just offer tissues and sympathy like everyone expected. She sat down in that booth, pulled out a small notebook that nobody had ever seen before, and started asking questions that didn't sound like they came from someone who just poured coffee for a living. "Mrs. Patterson, when exactly did you sign that mortgage modification?" Mary Ellen's voice was gentle, but her questions were precise. "And did they explain the balloon payment clause to you?" The elderly woman looked confused. Hell, most of the diner regulars looked confused. Since when did Mary Ellen Thompson know about balloon payments? But she just kept taking notes in that little book, her handwriting neat and deliberate, like someone who'd done this kind of thing before. Rick Hamilton, meanwhile, was getting more aggressive by the day. His development company had put up signs all along Main Street, future site of Millbrook Gaming and Entertainment Complex. The message was clear: resistance was futile. He'd strut into the diner every morning, order his black coffee and wheat toast, and make sure everyone heard his latest update about which family had come to their senses and agreed to sell. The Kowalski farm went for asking price yesterday, he'd announced to the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. Smart people know when it's time to cash out and move on. But something strange was happening. Families who'd been ready to pack up and leave suddenly weren't so sure anymore. The Hendersons discovered that their property deed had some interesting clauses about mineral rights that nobody had mentioned. The young couple who ran the hardware store found out they might qualify for historic preservation grants that would make selling unnecessary. And somehow, word was getting around about these discoveries. Not through the usual small-town gossip network, but quietly, person to person, family to family. If you didn't know better, you might think someone was coordinating it all. Mary Ellen never said much about these coincidences. When Rick confronted her directly, and he did more than once, she'd just shrug and say something like, "People talk, Mr. Hamilton. You know how it is in a small town." But there was something in her eyes when she said it, something that should have made Rick nervous if he'd been paying attention. Instead, he just got angrier. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" Rick cornered her one evening as she was closing up the diner, his face red with frustration. "Playing amateur paralegal, filling people's heads with false hope. You're going to get these families in real legal trouble, you know that." Mary Ellen just kept wiping down tables, her movements steady and calm. "I'm not playing anything, Mr. Hamilton. I'm just listening when people need someone to listen." The simplicity of her answer seemed to infuriate him even more. "Listening? You're meddling in business that's way over your head. These people need to understand reality, not get caught up in some fantasy about fighting the inevitable." That's when Mary Ellen stopped wiping the table and looked at him directly, really looked at him with an intensity that made Rick take a half step backward without realizing it. "You know, Mr. Hamilton, I've learned something interesting over the years. The people who talk the most about reality are usually the ones who are most afraid of what they don't understand." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "And there's a lot you don't understand about this town." What Rick didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that Mary Ellen Thompson had been making phone calls, late-night calls, to Chicago, to law offices with names like Patterson, McBride & Associates and Midwest Property Rights Coalition. Calls where she spoke in the kind of legal shorthand that doesn't come from watching Law & Order reruns. She'd sit in her small apartment above the diner, surrounded by legal documents and property surveys, and she'd talk about things like adverse possession claims and eminent domain limitations with the casual expertise of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms instead of serving coffee. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Thomas Mitchell finally showed up in Millbrook. Mitchell was Rick's heavy hitter, a real estate attorney from Columbus with a reputation for making property acquisition problems disappear. He was supposed to be the closer, the guy who would tie up all the loose ends and get Rick's casino project back on track. He walked into Rosie's diner like he owned the place, his expensive suit and briefcase making him stand out like a peacock in a chicken coop. "I need to speak with whoever's been advising the local property owners," Mitchell announced to the room, his voice carrying the kind of authority that usually made small-town folks nervous. "There seems to be some confusion about certain legal matters, and I'm here to set the record straight." Mary Ellen was behind the counter, refilling the coffee machine, but she'd gone very still. Not scared still, alert still, like a cat that's just spotted something interesting. "Coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice perfectly neutral. But there was something in the way she said it, something that made Mitchell look at her more carefully than he'd intended to. "Actually, yes, black." He settled into the center booth, Rick's usual spot, and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I understand there's been some amateur legal advice floating around town, people thinking they can fight progress with wishful thinking and Google searches." Mary Ellen brought him his coffee, and as she set the cup down, she glanced at the papers he had spread across the table. Just a quick glance, the kind any curious waitress might take. But Mitchell caught something in that glance, a flicker of recognition, maybe even amusement, that didn't belong on the face of someone who was supposed to be intimidated by legal documents. "Interesting property surveys," Mary Ellen said casually, refilling his cup. "The boundary descriptions on Lot 47 seem a little inconsistent with the county records from 1987, though." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Mitchell's head snapped up, his eyes narrow with sudden suspicion. "Excuse me?" Mary Ellen just smiled, that same quiet smile she'd been wearing for weeks. "Oh, nothing important, just something I noticed. Sometimes the old records don't match up with the new ones, you know. Happens all the time." But it was the way she said it, casual, knowledgeable, completely unimpressed by his expensive suit and legal reputation, that made Thomas Mitchell realize he might not be dealing with what he'd expected to find in Millbrook, Ohio. And for the first time since this whole mess started, someone other than Mary Ellen Thompson looked like they were beginning to understand that there was more to this story than anyone had imagined. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most ordinary places, and sometimes the truth comes out when you least expect it. Thomas Mitchell had been in Millbrook for 3 days, and he was starting to feel like he was losing his mind. Every document he reviewed, every property survey he examined, every legal precedent he thought he understood, Mary Ellen Thompson had somehow found a flaw, a loophole, or a historical inconsistency that shouldn't have been visible to anyone without serious legal training. And she was doing it while refilling coffee cups and taking orders for meatloaf specials. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Mitchell finally said on Friday morning, his patience worn down to nothing. The diner was mostly empty, except for a few regulars nursing their coffee and pretending not to listen. "But I've been practicing real estate law for 25 years, and I've never met a waitress who could spot a boundary discrepancy from across a table." Mary Ellen was wiping down the counter, that same maddeningly calm expression on her face. "Maybe you've just never met the right waitress, Mr. Mitchell." That's when Rick Hamilton burst through the door like a man on a mission, his face flushed with anger and something that looked a lot like panic. "Mitchell, we need to talk, now!" He slammed a folder down on the table so hard that coffee sloshed out of Mitchell's cup. "Do you know what I just found out? Do you have any idea what this woman has been doing behind our backs?" Mary Ellen looked up from her cleaning, and for the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely curious. Not worried, not defensive, just interested to see what Rick had discovered. "She's been filing legal challenges," Rick continued, his voice getting louder with each word. "Historic preservation applications, environmental impact requests, mineral rights surveys. She's been throwing up every legal roadblock she can think of, and somehow, they're all technically valid." Mitchell's face went pale. "That's impossible. Those kinds of filings require legal expertise," Rick finished, "exactly the kind of expertise that a small-town waitress shouldn't have." The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that happens right before lightning strikes. Mary Ellen set down her cleaning rag and looked at both men with an expression that was equal parts tired and amused. "You know, gentlemen, I've been waiting for this conversation for about 6 years now." Her voice was different somehow, still quiet, still controlled, but with an undertone of authority that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and everyone had just been too busy not seeing her to notice. 6 years ago, I came back to Millbrook to take care of my mother after my father passed away," Mary Ellen said, moving around the counter to face them directly. "I took this job because it was available, and because sometimes you do what you have to do for family, even when it means giving up everything you worked for." Mitchell was staring at her now with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for opposing counsel in a courtroom. "Before that, I was a partner at Patterson McBride & Associates in Chicago, specialized in property law and municipal development. Maybe you've heard of the firm, Mr. Mitchell."
The coffee cup slipped from Mitchell's hand and shattered on the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Patterson, McBride and Associates wasn't just any law firm. It was one of the most prestigious property law practices in the Midwest, the kind of place where partners billed $800 an hour and handled cases that made headlines in the Wall Street Journal. Rick Hamilton looked like he'd been punched in the stomach, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out.
"You're lying," Rick finally managed, but there was no conviction in his voice. "You're a waitress. You've been a waitress for 6 years." Mary Ellen reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a business card, old, worn around the edges, but still legible. "Mary Ellen Thompson, J.D., partner," she read aloud, "specializing in eminent domain defense and historic preservation law. I kept it as a reminder of who I used to be. Never thought I'd need it again." Mitchell picked up the card with shaking hands, and Mary Ellen could see the exact moment when recognition hit him. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "You're M.E. Thompson. You wrote the brief on the Riverside development case. That case changed property law in 3 states." Mary Ellen nodded. "Also the Henderson versus City of Springfield decision, the Lakefront Coalition appeal, and about 40 other cases that established precedent for exactly the kind of development project you're trying to push through here." But that wasn't even the biggest shock. Mary Ellen walked over to the old filing cabinet behind the cash register, the one everyone assumed held nothing but order forms and tax receipts, and pulled out a thick manila folder. "There's something else you gentlemen should know," she said, spreading the contents across the table where Rick had been holding court for weeks. "About 3 months ago, I finished reviewing my grandfather's estate papers. Turns out, Grandpa Joe was a lot smarter than anyone gave him credit for. The documents she laid out were property deeds, dozens of them, all bearing the same name, Joseph Thompson. My grandfather started buying up Main Street properties during the Depression when nobody thought they were worth anything, paid cash, kept quiet about it, and held on to them for 70 years. Mary Ellen's finger traced across deed after deed, each one representing another piece of the puzzle that Rick Hamilton thought he'd been putting together. As of last month, when the estate finally cleared probate, I own 63% of the commercial properties on Main Street, including the lot where you were planning to build your casino entrance." Rick Hamilton's face went through about 5 different colors before settling on a shade of gray that made him look like he was about to pass out. That's not possible. We researched the ownership records. We did title searches." Mary Ellen smiled, and this time there was no mistaking the sharp intelligence behind it. "You researched the records that were supposed to be public. Grandpa Joe was old-school careful about keeping his business private. Some of these properties were held in trust, some through shell companies he created back when nobody was paying attention to that sort of thing. All perfectly legal, all properly documented, all waiting for the right moment to surface." Thomas Mitchell was frantically shuffling through the documents, his legal mind trying to process what he was seeing. "This changes everything," he muttered. "The entire development plan, the financing agreements, the gaming commission applications." Mary Ellen nodded. "All based on the assumption that you could acquire the necessary properties through a combination of market purchases and eminent domain proceedings. But you can't use eminent domain against a property owner who refuses to sell, especially when that owner has a legitimate plan for historic preservation and community development." "Community development?" Rick's voice cracked like a teenager. Mary Ellen reached for another folder, this one filled with architectural drawings, business plans, and grant applications. "The Millbrook Heritage District Initiative. I've been working on it for 2 years, quietly building support, securing funding, getting federal and state approvals. Main Street is going to become a registered historic district with tax incentives for small businesses, tourism development that honors our agricultural heritage, and housing options that actual working families can afford." She looked directly at Rick, and her expression was one of calm satisfaction. "The kind of development that builds communities instead of destroying them." The diner had filled up during this conversation. Word travels fast in a small town, and now half of Millbrook was watching Rick Hamilton's empire crumble in real time. Mrs. Patterson was crying, but this time they were tears of relief. The young couple from the hardware store were holding hands and grinning like they'd just won the lottery. Even old Mr. Henderson had put down his newspaper to watch the show. "You planned this," Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You let me make a fool of myself for weeks, knowing you could stop me any time you wanted." Mary Ellen poured herself a cup of coffee, her own damn coffee, in her own damn diner, in the town where her family had been quietly protecting their neighbors for 3 generations. "No, Rick, I didn't plan this. I just waited for you to show everyone exactly who you really are. And then I showed them who I really am." She took a sip of her coffee and looked around at the faces of people she'd been serving for 6 years, people who were finally seeing her for the first time. "The difference is, I never forgot where I came from, and I never forgot that real power isn't about what you can take from people. It's about what you can help them keep." You know what happens in a small town when someone's world gets turned completely upside down? Word spreads faster than a grass fire in August, and by Sunday morning the whole story had traveled from Millbrook to 3 neighboring counties. Rick Hamilton went from being the big-shot developer who was going to modernize the town to being the guy who got schooled by a waitress. Except she wasn't just a waitress, was she? The local paper ran the story on the front page with a headline that Rick probably wished he could forget. "Local lawyer saves Main Street while serving coffee." Thomas Mitchell packed up his briefcase and headed back to Columbus that same Friday afternoon, but not before doing something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked back into Rosie's diner, found Mary Ellen behind the counter like nothing had happened, and extended his hand. "Ma'am, I want to apologize," he said, loud enough for the whole place to hear. "I came here thinking I was dealing with people who didn't understand the law, and it turns out I was the one who didn't understand the situation." Mary Ellen shook his hand with the same quiet dignity she'd shown through everything else, but there was something in her eyes, not triumph exactly, but a kind of weary satisfaction. "No harm done, Mr. Mitchell. We all make assumptions sometimes." But Rick Hamilton? Rick was a different story entirely. The man who'd strutted into that diner every morning for weeks, treating Mary Ellen like she was invisible, suddenly couldn't seem to show his face anywhere in town. And when he did venture out, the change was dramatic. Gone was the swagger, the loud voice, the assumption that everyone would jump when he said jump. He'd slink into the hardware store or the post office with his head down, mumbling his business and leaving as quickly as possible. Mrs. Patterson, bless her heart, actually felt sorry for him. "He looks like a broken man," she told Mary Ellen one morning over coffee. "I almost feel bad for him." Mary Ellen stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "I don't feel bad for him, Mrs. Patterson, but I don't feel good about it either. That's not what this was about." The real transformation, though, was in how people saw Mary Ellen, and, more importantly, how she saw herself. For 6 years, she'd been living like she was in hiding, keeping her head down, playing a role that was just a shadow of who she really was. But now she was walking into the bank to discuss development loans, meeting with state tourism officials about heritage grants, fielding phone calls from reporters who wanted to know how a small-town waitress had outsmarted a big city development company. The truth was, Mary Ellen Thompson was finally being herself again, and it was like watching someone come back to life. "I want to hire you," old Mr. Henderson said one Tuesday morning, sliding a folder across the table toward her. "My son's been trying to get me to sell the farm to some agribusiness corporation. Says I'm too old to fight their lawyers if they decide to make trouble about the water rights." He tapped the folder with one gnarled finger. "But if you're taking clients again..." Mary Ellen looked at the folder, then at Mr. Henderson's hopeful face, and something clicked into place. She'd been so focused on saving the town that she hadn't thought about what came next for her personally. But this felt right, helping people who needed someone in their corner, using her skills to protect families instead of helping corporations get richer. The Millbrook Heritage District initiative moved forward faster than anyone had expected, partly because Mary Ellen knew exactly which bureaucratic buttons to push, but mostly because the whole town was behind it now. The hardware store applied for a grant to restore their original 1920s storefront. The old movie theater that had been closed for 15 years suddenly had investors interested in bringing it back to life. Even Rosie's Diner got a makeover, new paint, restored vintage fixtures, and a small plaque by the door that read Millbrook Heritage District, S 2023. Mary Ellen kept the same coffee-stained counter, though. Some things were worth preserving exactly as they were. But the most unexpected change came 3 months later, when Rick Hamilton showed up at the diner on a Tuesday morning. Not the old Rick, full of bluster and demands, but a quieter version who looked like he'd spent a lot of sleepless nights thinking about things. He sat in the corner booth, not his old power seat in the center, and waited until Mary Ellen had a moment to talk. "I owe you an apology," he said when she came over with the coffee pot. "Not just for the way I talked to you, but for the way I talked about you, about this whole town, really." Mary Ellen studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation she'd learned to recognize in her Chicago days, but all she saw was genuine regret. "Apology accepted, Rick," she said, refilling her cup. "But what I really want to know is what you're planning to do now." Rick stirred his coffee slowly, like he was buying time to get the words right. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. My family's been in this town for 3 generations, just like yours. Maybe it's time I remembered what that's supposed to mean." What Rick didn't say, what took Mary Ellen weeks to piece together from conversations around town, was that he'd quietly withdrawn from the Gaming Commission application, dissolved his development company, and started looking into sustainable agriculture projects that could bring jobs to the area without destroying its character. He'd lost a lot of money on the casino deal, probably more than he wanted to admit, but he seemed to be handling it better than anyone expected. "Turns out there's more than one way to build a legacy," he told Mary Ellen one morning when she asked him about it directly. "Some ways just take longer to pay off." The real test came when the State Tourism Board approved Millbrook for historic district status, bringing with it federal funding for small business development and infrastructure improvements. Mary Ellen could have used her position because by then everyone acknowledged that she was basically running the whole initiative to freeze Rick out completely. Instead, she included his agricultural development ideas in the master plan, creating space for both heritage tourism and modern farming techniques that respected the land. "You don't build a strong community by keeping people out," she explained to Mrs. Patterson, who'd questioned the decision. "You build it by giving everyone a chance to contribute something worthwhile." By winter, Mary Ellen had quietly transitioned from full-time waitress to part-time legal consultant, still serving coffee in the mornings but spending her afternoons in a small office above the hardware store, helping families navigate property disputes, estate planning, and small business legal issues. She charged fair rates, nothing like the Chicago prices, and took payment plans from people who needed help but couldn't afford big city legal fees. "It's funny," she told her daughter during one of their weekly phone calls. "I thought I was giving up my career when I came back here. Turns out I was just waiting for the right way to use it." The transformation wasn't just about Mary Ellen, though. It was about what happens when a community realizes that the people they've been overlooking might be exactly the people they need most. Mrs. Patterson started volunteering at the county legal aid clinic, using organizational skills she'd developed running the church auxiliary. The young couple from the hardware store launched a craftsman training program for high school students. Even old Mr. Henderson started offering farm internships for kids who wanted to learn sustainable agriculture. It was like the whole town had been waiting for permission to be better than they thought they could be, and Mary Ellen's example had given them that permission. And Rick Hamilton? He surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming one of the Heritage District's most effective advocates. Not the loud, demanding version of advocacy he'd used before, but something quieter and more genuine. He started showing up at city council meetings, not to push his own agenda, but to support other people's ideas. He volunteered for the Main Street cleanup days. He even learned to make a decent cup of coffee when Mary Ellen needed someone to cover the morning shift at the diner. It wasn't redemption exactly. Some things can't be undone with good intentions, but it was growth, and in a small town, sometimes that's enough. A year and a half later, Mary Ellen Thompson was standing behind the same coffee-stained counter at Rosie's Diner, but everything else had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible back when Rick Hamilton was holding court in the center booth. The morning crowd was bigger now, tourists stopping by after visiting the restored grain elevator that had become Millbrook's signature attraction, young families who'd moved to town because they'd heard about the Affordable Housing Initiative, college students interning with the Heritage District program. But the core group was still there. Mrs. Patterson with her crossword puzzle, Mr. Henderson arguing politics with whoever would listen, the young couple from the hardware store sharing a plate of pancakes before opening their shop. "You know what I love most about this place now?" Mary Ellen's daughter Sarah said during one of her visits home from graduate school. She was sitting in that corner booth, the same one where Rick used to sulk after his world fell apart, but now it was just another seat in a thriving community diner. "It's not that you saved the town, Mom. It's that you helped the town save itself." Mary Ellen looked around at the familiar faces, the comfortable rhythms of small-town life, the sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. That's the thing about communities, honey. They're stronger than people think. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them of what they're capable of.
The Heritage District had exceeded everyone's expectations, bringing in enough tourism revenue to support 3 new small businesses and create jobs for a dozen local families. The old movie theater was showing films again, classic movies on Friday nights, new releases on weekends, and a monthly documentary series that had become surprisingly popular with visitors from the surrounding counties. The grain elevator had been converted into a museum and event space that told the story of Midwest agriculture, and the walking tours that started at Rosie's Diner were booked solid through the fall. But the success wasn't just measured in dollars and visitors. It was in the way people walked a little taller, spoke up more often at town meetings, and looked at their neighbors with something that hadn't been there before: respect. Rick Hamilton's transformation had been the most surprising part of the whole story. Not because he'd become a saint, nobody expected that, but because he'd found a way to channel his ambition into something that actually helped people. His sustainable agriculture consulting business was thriving, working with small farms throughout Ohio to implement environmentally responsible practices that increased both productivity and profitability. He'd even hired 2 recent college graduates, creating the kind of good jobs that small towns desperately needed to keep their young people from leaving. "I spent so many years trying to build something impressive," he told Mary Ellen one morning as she refilled his coffee. "Turns out the impressive part wasn't the building. It was figuring out what was worth building." The conversation happened on a Tuesday in late September, one of those perfect fall mornings when the light coming through the diner windows made everything look like a Norman Rockwell painting. Rick had been coming in regularly for months now, not to make speeches or demand attention, but just to be part of the community rhythm. Sometimes he'd help Mary Ellen with the morning rush when she was short-staffed. Sometimes he'd sit quietly in the corner, working on his laptop and occasionally joining conversations about local issues. The change in him wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures or public apologies, but it was real, and everyone could see it. "I've been thinking about something you said last year," Rick continued, stirring his coffee slowly, "about real power being what you help people keep, not what you take from them. I didn't understand it then, but I think I'm starting to now." Mary Ellen nodded, recognizing the look in his eyes. It was the same expression she'd seen in the mirror 6 years ago when she first came back to Millbrook, the look of someone trying to figure out who they wanted to be instead of who they thought they were supposed to be. Power's a funny thing, Rick. The more you try to grab it, the less of it you actually have. But when you use whatever influence you've got to make other people stronger, that's when you discover what real strength looks like. The lesson had applications far beyond Millbrook, Ohio, and Mary Ellen knew it. Over the past year, she'd been invited to speak at conferences about rural development, sustainable tourism, and community-led economic planning. The story of the waitress lawyer who saved Main Street had become something of a legend in small-town America. But Mary Ellen was careful to always emphasize the same point. This wasn't about one person being exceptional. It was about ordinary people finding extraordinary ways to support each other. Every community has people like me, she'd tell audiences. People with skills and knowledge and ideas who aren't being heard because nobody's really listening. The question isn't whether the talent exists, it's whether you're creating space for it to emerge.
That philosophy had become the foundation for everything Millbrook was building. When the town council needed to make decisions about zoning or development, they didn't just consult the usual suspects, they actively sought out perspectives from people who'd been overlooked before. When the school district needed help with budget planning, they discovered that the janitor had an accounting degree and 20 years of experience managing nonprofit finances. When the fire department needed to upgrade their equipment, they learned that one of the volunteer firefighters was a grant-writing expert who'd been quietly securing funding for the animal shelter for years. It was like the whole town had been looking at itself through the wrong lens, and once they adjusted their vision, they could see resources and capabilities they'd never noticed before. The most meaningful change, though, was in the conversations. Not the big public discussions at town meetings or Chamber of Commerce events, but the everyday interactions that happen when people see each other as complete human beings instead of job descriptions or economic categories. Mrs. Patterson started talking to the teenagers who hung out at the diner after school and discovered that several of them were interested in local history. Now she was training them to give tours at the Heritage Center. Mr. Henderson began sharing farming stories with the urban families who'd moved to town for the affordable housing, and ended up starting a community garden that brought people together across generational and cultural lines. The young couple from the hardware store organized skill-sharing workshops where neighbors taught each other everything from basic plumbing to advanced computer skills. "You know what I realized?" Mary Ellen said to Sarah during that same visit as they walked down Main Street on a Saturday evening past the restored storefronts and the families enjoying dinner at the outdoor tables that had been set up in front of the diner. "I spent so many years in Chicago thinking that success meant climbing some invisible ladder, getting recognition from people who didn't really know me, accumulating achievements that looked impressive on paper. But this," she gestured toward the scene around them, the children playing while their parents chatting with neighbors, the teenagers working their first jobs at local businesses, the elderly residents feeling valued and included instead of pushed aside. This is what success actually looks like. It's not about what you accomplish for yourself. It's about what you make possible for other people. The story of Mary Ellen Thompson and Millbrook, Ohio, became more than just a local legend. It became proof that small acts of courage can have consequences far beyond what anyone imagines. Not the Hollywood version of courage with dramatic confrontations and grand gestures, but the quieter kind that shows up when someone decides to stop hiding their light under a bushel, to stop accepting that things have to be the way they've always been, to stop underestimating what ordinary people can accomplish when they work together towards something worthwhile. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that every community, every workplace, every family has its own version of Mary Ellen Thompson, waiting for the right moment to step forward and remind everyone what they're truly capable of achieving. The diner still opens at 6 a.m. every morning, and Mary Ellen Thompson still makes the best coffee in 3 counties. But now when she looks around at the faces of her neighbors and friends, she sees something that wasn't there before. The quiet confidence of people who know their own worth and aren't afraid to show it. And that, more than any legal victory or development project, is the kind of transformation that changes everything.